good to go?
Great to go.
Hey everyone, Conor here for footfetishporn.com, and today we're going to tackle sort of calves, calf function, and all things from there. So there's a lot of talk about in terms of program design and sort of people mention frequency, different loading schemes, all those different things for calves. But the big context of the reps, the sets, is actually the execution per individual rep, and sort of how efficient that is going to flow from everything down the line. So the first place I think you can look at if you're trying to achieve calf growth is sort of how you execute. So if I had to say, out of all muscle groups, tell me if you agree, Nick, things such as lateral raises, maybe leg curl, are the only things that really contend with as shit form as maybe calves. The average sort of calf that you see across the gym is very often an execution mode issue. Yes, there's some theories with sort of androgen receptors down there, but look, I think it's most often an execution issue.
Yeah.
So with regard to any calf movement, seated, standing, whatever, we'll sort of get into how we can do this in a second. It's important to realise sort of the function of calves and what they do and what they don't do. So if we tackle sort of the gastroc first, the main thing you're sort of looking at is plantar flexion. It also does seem to do a bit of knee flexion stuff at particular ranges with particular foot angles, but we'll leave that out for today. So where I see people go wrong with their movements is, for starters, range of motion. So there's a lot of theories out there with range of motion as you walk and what you don't achieve through training, blah blah blah. But rarely you actually see people get a fully shortened calf and a fully lengthened calf. And if you look at sort of force production theories, there's good basically theoretical evidence that you could grow more there. So when people actually raise on the way up, so we're going to use Nick here for example. By the way, you can sort of use barefoot. That's something Eric Serrano likes to do, for example, for calves. But Nick says he doesn't want to get the feet out. He's got a private subscription website, for his foot stuff. So we can't interfere with his business.
It is what it is.
Got to pay the bills,
yeah.
right? So theoretically, I think the first thing is sort of have an attachment with sort of each sort of area of the foot. There's going to be different sort of things which line with what the big toe does versus the other four. But having some sort of control of all of those, somewhat like you do with your hands, can be a handy start point. But if we're sort of going past there, the most important thing in terms of the contraction element is making sure we're sort of thinking not just in your movements of going up in the air, but thinking, okay, how's the ankle sort of travel forward? Because that's really what's relevant towards what the function is. When people think up too much, they sort of do weird sort of flexion movements of the feet that aren't necessarily too relevant to what the calf actually does. I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but not really necessarily calf straight away. So with this sort of thing with Nick, one thing you look at, which people will very commonly do, as they sort of raise up throughout the lift, you very commonly see a lot of movements like that towards the end range. One thing to understand with the gastroc, that's not one function of it. In fact, it sort of takes away from the most shortened position you can do. So when you're doing these movements, what we should really be focusing on is how much can I get back here forward at the top of the lift. In fact, it's really just a function of, okay, ideally in an ideal world, knees, it's not going to happen, but knees, sort of ankles and big toe might be in a straight line. Whether you actually get there is another issue. Ballerinas seem to do it, I can't. But that's the first thing to consider. So moving right up there, you're actually thinking throughout the movement. Don't think up as much as you think forward, 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 forward. You probably notice a hard contraction there already. Now, the next thing we're going to look at is sort of the lengthen range. So lengthen range is quite interesting. So with this one, trying to avoid too much inversion, again, is key. Other things is to pull right up and actually contract your tibials. So the tibialis anterior, you'll actually be able to see if it's contracted, if people are well developed enough. Sorry, Nick. Via a little loop around here. The next most important execution thing from here, I think, is initiation of movement out of the hole. So it's been said that the Achilles tendon is the strongest tendon in the body. You can theoretically get a lot of force out of there. So some people recommend really long stretches in that position. That's something you can do, but I think what's most important is simply your intent out of the bottom position. If you're thinking explosive, you're probably going to have a lot of tension distributed away from the relevant muscles towards more of that tendon-based structures. Yes, you can desensitize it in the stretch, but probably not fully the way you want to. So when you're out there, it's important to first think straight away of, okay, bringing this forward. That's how you initiate movement. So we haven't even got to a calf exercise yet, but yet these are things you've got to be considering basically internally. Right, so now we've got Nick here on a hack squat / standing calf raise. So we're sort of going to present those points we just mentioned before in practice. So in this bottom position right here, ideally things are relatively lined up. Yes, you do have a bit of a Q angle, we'll ignore that for a second. With the foot position, I want just a bit more alignment just there. So there's a little bit of inversion with the neck, and that's something we've been working on. There's a few theories of how that applies to fascial lines and stuff, but for now, trying to create some sort of alignment is king. So this one, I want to see just a smidge more arch in the left foot, so sort of rotate punch, etc. Yep. Cool. Now, straight away, go into a deeper position if you can. So, again, that shit test we're looking for is sort of a contraction down here. Now, the first thing you're going to do out of the hole is sort of very slowly come up. Think about pushing that away. Sort of law of equal and opposite reaction here. And from there, keeping the foot tucked in, tucked in, tucked in, tucked in. Keep raising higher, 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 higher. And think feet forward, feet forward, feet forward. You feel the contraction there?
Yeah.
Cool, and just keep the legs a tad more tucked in. Ankles a tad more tucked in. A little bit less arch, believe it or not. Pushing through that big toe in particular. Yeah, that's it. Feel that a bit more? Cool, lovely. So, believe it or not, guys, before you look into program design and all these things, that's enough if you like. Before you look into program design, etc., you can look into these ranges that you're otherwise not actually trained to its most potential. With program design, some good sort of thoughts, I guess we'll duck out there. In terms of fiber type, blah, blah, you do hear different theories for calves. There's pretty good reasons to suggest that you're soleus, so that's the one underneath that's more so responsible when you've got a bent knee and you're doing calf raise functions. Might respond better to higher reps, sort of the endurance style factor of that muscle. And gastroc seems to be pretty mixed. But frequency, like law of most like small muscle groups, you can train more frequently because less overall overload, but you'll run across junk volume quicker in a session. So basically what that means is for most small muscle groups, you can handle less sets per like sort of session, but because of sort of their overload curves, you can handle them more frequently. So sort of there's been like popularized approaches of like sort of cars every day. There might be some like merit to that. At the end of the day, it depends on your sort of volume and intensity and stuff. But I think I like it about a 3 times a week approach for starting things. And this is one of those things you can potentiate. As your contractions get better and better, suddenly your focus can be sort of more like loading etc. At the moment, like you're just been battling an efficiency issue straight away, like against that sort of Achilles tendon and all those things. So sort of tick off that bucket, and ideally, hopefully you don't have to focus on these things too much longer. Eventually, if your brain, you're like, one conscious thought, you can sort of move towards things such as, efforts, execution, all these things, as opposed to like too much function and all that stuff. Another thing that sort of, this is a John Meadows trick that he reports works quite well, is sort of training actually the tibius itself. So there's a range of ways you can do this. Basic idea would be something like sort of lifting the toes in the air like such. In fact, like a few people have hypothesized getting strong enough tibialis anterior is going to correlate with like less things such as shin splints and etc. because of their force absorbing role. So maybe you can superset these things in between. You can do this just body weight. Honestly, that loading generally is enough. You can use bands, etc. But the main goal of this exercise here was really just in regards to, before you look into some magic program design or say it's purely genetic etc., make sure you've ticked off these buckets of execution. Make sure you're owning sort of the length and shortened range, because to be honest, you don't see that in the gym at all. And the funny thing is, ones that people do like those big calves, those sort of small tendon sites, those lower attachments, they generally do this stuff anyway. So I guess you're sort of like, success sort of leaves clues. You're trying to find like how to emulate that with yourself, even if you're set up a little bit differently. So hope that was somewhat of a handy video, and hopefully something you can apply.